Good morning to all of you. This is Dr. S.C. Hajela, Associate Professor, Department of English, Sri Jainarayan Mishra PG College. This is the second part of my lecture on literary text and modern context. I was talking about new criticism and how when new criticism talked about close reading and favored that type of reading in which we do not talk about biographical details or historical circumstances or sociological circumstances and just see the functioning of the text. It was very much criticized by Chicago critics, especially by R.S. Crane. But as we move further, when we come to the second half of 20th century, we find the emergence of a new kind of criticism. And you might have heard the name of Northrop Frye. Northrop Frye propounded myth and archetypical criticism. In the year 1957, he published his monumental work, Anatomy of Criticism. And this book can be regarded as most enduring critical work of the century. Frye systematized the whole literature and believed that all literary expression is controlled by a small number of abiding literary universals. In his own words, four narrative pre-generic categories which are logically prior to the usually literary genres. These pre-generic mythoi, these models of all models, these deepest of structures, which are the inevitable constituents of literary imagination. Frye was of the opinion that human mind is very creative, but he studied the literature of all of the world and found that there are some myths which are in the center of all literature. All of the literature of the world is based on those mythoi. They are the models of all models. So he was talking about the deepest of structures which function in the mind of a man and which have always functioned in the history of mankind. So his view was that a critic's task is to receive those structures and convey to the readers. So when we follow myth and archetypal criticism as propounded by Northrop Frye, what we do in a particular kind of work, we see which myth or what kind of text it is. Because there are some archetypal texts or there are some universal myths which are there, which are imbibed in the text. And when we explicate the structure of the text, we find there are some universal things, some literary universals, which are present in all the literatures of the world. So in this way, his attempt was to find some literary universals. So the object of reading of the text was to discover the underlying mythical patterns in literature. The literary text was a mythic discourse, a literary universe, and the reader's duty was to read it in that perspective. Clear? It was believed that every literary text has a mythic discourse, and that mythic discourse is to be explored and to be unraveled. And reading the text became surely a difficult task, but it surely enriched the understanding of the text and revealed how human mind has conceived literature through myths, irrespective of man's geographical and ethnic differences. This is the only kind of criticism which said that all literature is conceived on certain parameters. And myths, they may not be apparent, but they function, they underlie in literature. And when we explore these mythical structures, mythical patterns in a particular kind of work, we find that human mind works all over the world in the same manner, whether we live in England or in India or in Australia. We may have ethnic differences, we may have geographical differences, but what is most important is the imbibing of some abiding literary universals. So in this sense, Northrop Frye's contribution to literary criticism is very significant. At the end of 1950s, we see a very different kind of criticism. The originator of this criticism, which we know as phenomenological criticism, it was German philosopher Husserl, who regarded it as an attempt to describe human consciousness. Phenomenology as an approach to literature is usually associated with the theory and practice of Geneva School of Critics, most notably Georges Paulet and J. Hillis Miller. Paulet's The Metamorphosis of the Circle, 1966, and Miller's The Disappearance of God, 1963, and Poets of Reality, which came in 1965. They came one after another on the literary scene, and they suggested a new kind of methodology. That was the methodology of the criticism of consciousness. What they believe? However, Hillis Miller subsequently rejected this approach and opted to structuralism and then post-structuralism. His early work on Dickens and Hardy shows the heights of phenomenological criticism. What a phenomenological critic does? He tries to bridge the gap between biography and criticism. He believes that the consciousness of the world and the author is imbibed in a particular text. So reading a text means an entry to the consciousness of the author and to the consciousness of the world which has been visualized by the author. So this was in this kind of criticism, in phenomenological criticism, a text became a gateway to the consciousness of not only the author, but of whole of the world. So in practice, when it started with the work, and through it attempts to trace the pattern of the author's mind. In practice, reader discovered his own consciousness while discovering the consciousness of the author. It is a very difficult job to know about the consciousness of the author. So apparently, philosophically, it was very sound. Husserl was very much right that a text is nothing but the epitome of the consciousness of the author. An author imbibes that consciousness from his own world. So the consciousness of the world is transferred to the author, and through the text, that consciousness is transferred from the text to the reader. So a reader can construct the consciousness of the author through the text. So this kind of methodology also proved to be very difficult for the readers, because as I told you that discovering the consciousness of the author, a common reader discovered his own consciousness in the literary works. You might have heard the name of Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure was writing as early as 1920s, but his works were translated very late, And in late 1960s, one sees the rise of structuralism. Structuralism applies great linguist Saussure's ideas about language to literary text. Saussure was a linguist. He believed that text is a self-sufficient system. He was studying language. And you know that a text is made of language. We cannot study a text without studying the language. So, what a structuralist does, his primary concern is with the words. He says that words are signs and they function as signifiers or signifieds. And he studied the internal order of the language. Language is a system of signs. Meaning is created through the play of this signifier and signifieds. It rejected a conventional interest in life beyond the text and prefers to see every text as a construct working by certain rules. A typically structuralist approach adopts a position of not seeing things within the cultural context of the society. What is happening in the society? So they are not affected with the sociological or cultural or historical or biographical impact of the text. They see the text and how the language functions in the text. That is most important for them. French critic Roland Barthes, with his brilliant books, writing Degree Zero, critical essays, The Pleasure of the Text, etc., they are his early works, though he has also transcended from structuralism to post-structuralism. But in his early works, he has applied the techniques of structuralist approach successfully. Structuralism attempts to focus on the text alone, rejecting the interpretation in favor of a description of the text operations. It takes into account both paradigmatic and syntagmatic patterns of language and drives out the meaning of a text. Like new critics, linguists or structuralists also believed that there is meaning in the text. Meaning is inherent in the text. Clear? And structuralists believed that if we critically analyze the patterns of language or the inner functioning of the language or the inner patterns of the language, we can derive out meaning. So this approach was applied to other disciplines also, in anthropology, in sociology, in other fields of humanities. Structuralism was used, and everywhere structures were studied. Clear? Just as Saussure was studying the structures inherent in language, in the same way, structures inherent in society and culture were studied by Levi-Strauss and by other sociologists of his times. But this approach failed to give adequate attention to the vision or worldview implicit in a literary work and resulted as the worst in a very mechanized activity on the part of the reader and proved to be an artificial ordering system. So what is the main objection to structuralism or to this linguist approach? A linguist or a structuralist, for him, all texts are the same because they are all made of language. Okay? And language is made of certain systems and they have inherent structures. So they studied structures and structures within the structures, and ultimately for them meaning lived hidden within these layers of structures. Clear? For them every work was made of language. Clear? And meaning can be created if we analyze structures within the language. They do not make moral, they do not make moral judgments. Clear? So this ultimately this exercise also proved to be a sometimes very boring also. It was a very mechanized activity on the part of the reader and proved to be a artificial ordering system. Clear? Those who criticized it, they said that meaning does not lie in the language. It is man, it is the reader who creates meaning. And man himself imposes artificial ordering system in the reading of language. So we move further and come into the era of post-structuralism. Post-structuralism is not juxtaposed with structuralism. It is just a development of structuralism. There were many premises of structuralism which were contradicted or challenged by post-structuralism. And as we move right from 1960s, if you see 1960s, by the end of 1960s or at the beginning of 1970s, we see the emergence of post-structuralism or what you say postmodernism. And most of the ideas or concepts which have been propounded right from the beginning of the 20th century regarding the reading of the text, about meaning, about text, about essential quality of the text, they were all challenged in the forthcoming theories or concepts. Reader response criticism and reception theory is one of them. It was in Germany in the early 1970s that the role of the reader was emphasized by critics like Wolfgang Aischer and Roman Ingarden. Aischer, in his book The Implied Reader 1974 and Act of Reading 1978, gave rise to the reader response criticism. What was this reader response criticism? According to this theory, the text largely determines the response, but it suggests that the text is full of gaps which the reader fills in his own way. They believed that actually meaning is not inherent in the text. It is the reader who creates meaning. The text is full of gaps, and these gaps are like dots. And just as by adding the dots, we make a particular kind of picture or give it a particular kind of meaning. In the same way, a text doesn't have meaning. It is a long chain of gaps, and it is the response of the reader which determines the meaning of the text. And this was very revolutionary. If in the very beginning of 20th century, Marxist or biological critics or sociological critics or all the positionist critics were talking about background studies. They were talking about the author. And as we advance with the generation of T.S. Eliot onwards, we see that the shift has changed from author to the text. But after structuralism, you will find that there is again a paradigm shift, and this is shift towards the reader. Now critics realize that reader has to play a very important role in the meaning-making process. Generally, students make confusion between reader response criticism and reception theory. So, what is the difference? I will make it clear. There was another critic, Robert Hans Joss, who is more concerned with the general response to literature over a period of time than with the individual responses. Actually, in reader response criticism, critics were focusing on individual responses. How a particular reader receives a text. That was more important for a reader response critics. And they believed that There are as many texts as are the readers. Clear? But in reception theory, what happened that literature over a period of time, how generally people respond to a particular kind of literature over a period of time. So it was a in reception theory, collective response towards a particular kind of literature was studied. Clear? For example, if we study how Shakespearean works were responded by Elizabethan people or by 18th century people or by 20th century people, that type of study will be reception theory. Clear? So this theory stresses on the text that provides a chain stimulus and reader completes the process. In the terminology of reception theory, the reader concretizes the literary work, which in itself no more than a chain of organized black marks on a page. They believe that whatever is written in the text, it is like black marks on a page. And it is the reader who makes the text, who constructs the text. Without this continuous active participation of the reader's part, there would be no literary text at all. In such sort of reading, the text became no more than a series of clues to a reader. They believe that the text gives some hints. It gives some hints, some invitation to construct language into meaning. So a reader is always engaged in a meaning-making process. Clear? Whatever language there is, that is turned into meaning by the reader. So to a reception critic, the text comes ready equipped with indeterminacy, and the reader must concretize it correctly. Really, it was a very tough task assigned to the reader because the whole onus was on the shoulders of the reader. Text, as it came to the reader, was full of indeterminate meaning, and a meaning was constructed by the reader. In 1964, Derrida, with his famous essay, Structure and Sign, which he read in a seminar at Hopkins University, he became very famous because his pronouncements stirred the critical world a lot and paved a path to study and understand history, philosophy, and literature with new perspectives and strategies. He said that all readings are misreadings in the sense that they impose ordering strategies. Advocating a strategy of subverting the hierarchies inherent in texts and discourses, he laid stress to explore inherent contradictions in the text. He said, the job of a reader is to explain gaps and silences, exclusions, consciously or unconsciously, which are ingrained in the text. He believes the text is not ordered piece. There are so many things which are unsaid. There are gaps and silences and exclusions in the text. Generally, texts have a center. They focus on something, and reader should deconstruct the text. So he gave the idea of decentering. He said that whatever hierarchies are established in the text theoretically or through the text, they should be deconstructed. So he is talking of decentering. He gave the theory of deference. Clear? And what it meant? He said that one signifier doesn't have one signified. There are signifiers and signifiers and no signifieds. So a text is just an endless stream of signifiers with words only pointing to other words without any determinate meaning. So Derrida doesn't believe that there is order, there is meaning. He is against any essentialist instance. He doesn't believe that meaning is ingrained in the text. He says that a text is full of indeterminacies, and these indeterminacies have to be explored, and they have to be sorted out, and they have to be explained. He believed a typical deconstructive reading emphasizes the contradictions the writer cannot control, or shows how a text becomes confused and puzzled because there is a gap between the feeling and the experience. Derrida believed that words have no determinate meanings, and the critic's job is to analyze and drive its meanings. So, Derrida didn't believe that we can come to a final meaning. Whatever we derive out, that is simply a meaning, not the meaning. It is not an ultimate meaning. His theory, popularly known as deconstruction, fails to acknowledge this possibility that a text, whether literary or philosophical, can confront experience in a way that communicates itself to the reader. He does not believe that a text can be inexhaustible in its meaning. And this was a very revolutionary idea when he talked of reversing the hierarchies inherent in the text. He was opening up new ways of reading the text. He inspired number of feminists and post-colonial writers and critics to see that whatever texts are available in the world, they have left so many things unsaid, undiscussed, unfocused, marginalized, and there is a need to pay attention to all those discourses, all those narrations. As we move ahead and come to 1970s and 80s, we see that there is again a sociological turn in literary studies with culture studies and new historicism. And in Buckingham Center of Culture Studies in England, contemporary English reality and cultural forms, including films and mass media, were scrutinized. There was a very famous man, Raymond Williams, who is the chief of the cultural critics. He broke the boundary between the high and popular culture and the hierarchy that this implies. They were also critical of the idea of a canon. So he talked about structures of feeling. He said that culture, there is no high culture or low culture. Every kind of culture is good, and a particular culture can be studied by studying different structures of feeling. So instead of evaluating what is great, the cultural critics wish to relate a literary text to its cultural context. As such, cultural criticism is interdisciplinary, for it involves studying the whole way of life, which includes the social, the political, the economic, etc. Williams stated in his book, The Long Revolution, I quote, "I would then define the theory of culture as the study of the relationship between elements in a whole way of life. The analysis of culture is the attempt to discover the nature of the organization, which is the complex of these relationships." So he was studying the complex of relationships which are the core part of any culture. And he says that literary works are also product of such cultures. So without understanding the framing or structuring of the cultures, we cannot understand the literature which is produced by them. Analysis of particular works or institutions is, in this context, analysis of their essential kind of organization. A key word in such analysis is pattern. And we see that again, we heard of pattern and structure when we were talking of structuralism. And culture critics again talked about pattern and structure, but they were studying it in a very larger sense in for the study of society. We also have a new kind of criticism by 1980s. Stephen Greenblatt, in his path-breaking work Renaissance Self-Fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare, which came in 1980, he analyzed the ways in which writers like Moore, Tyndale, Spencer, and Marlowe fashioned their self-identities through a network of social, psychological, political, new, and intellectual discourses. He sees Shakespeare's plays as being centrally and repeatedly concerned with the production and containment of subversion and disorder. Michel Foucault was a strong influence on cultural critics and new historicists. He sought to study cultures in terms of power relationships. Unlike Marxists, he saw power not simply as repressive or oppressive of one against another, but as a complex of forces, ways of thinking, speaking, etc. New historicism says that whatever texts are produced by the authors, they are not very innocent. Authors also have certain ideologies which they propound, and sometimes they also become part of that power politics or power relationships which go on in the society. They are not completely cut off from that power relationships which go on in their culture or society. So in this way, Stephen Greenblatt showed that even plays of Shakespeare, they are preparing the minds of the people against any subversion or disorder which may fall on the throne at that time. So, in some way or the other, his plays are favoring the monarchy, or they are standing, taking sides of monarchy and create and showing to the people what are the dangers of subversion and disorder. We see that unlike Marxist, they are not uh, New Historicism and Foucault, both of them have shown that power politics cannot be understood as one category or the other. We cannot say that power is simply repressive or oppressive. They have also talked about how power can be used for good purposes also. So Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, though they were not primarily literary critics, their philosophical, political, and psychoanalytical positions have immensely impacted the critical postulations of feminist critics and post-colonial critics like Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and Gayatri Spivak to expose the intricate relationship of the powerful and the weak in different texts and discourses of literature. So we see that through different theories and concepts, we have now equipped with many perspectives. There are different ways to see a particular kind of text. We cannot say that all these theories can be applied to all the text. Some texts are prone to a particular kind of criticism. You know that all these theories till now, they have given us certain lessons. And the first lesson which we have to learn is, as a modern reader, that the reality of the world is too hybrid to be captured by the author. So an author's version of reality is not reliable. Authenticity of representation is a farce. Second thing is that we have to understand this thing, that meaning in the text is not author's construct. Author is himself or herself a construct. What author thought, that was different. Text is not liable to be completely the carbon copy of author's mind, because author himself is a construct. So we have to see the text, not talk about what author had in his mind. Third thing is, meaning in the text is not determinate. One reading is as valid as another reading. So there is no question of the meaning. All meanings are valid, all readings are valid, and all readings yield to different meanings. So text is polyphonic. Polyphonic means just as one thing may give different sounds, in the same way, one meaning cannot be attached to a particular text. A particular text may have different meanings to different readers. This thing is to be understood. And next thing is that generally text is regarded as an organic whole, as new critics thought it to be. Modern theory says that text has its coups, slips, silences, and they are to be scrutinized and interpreted. We should not go to the text thinking that any kind of text will be complete, full of meaning, will have everything good and nothing odd. So it is not an organic whole. It has its construction, and there are so many flaws inherent in it. Clear? There are coups and slips and silences which have to be discovered and interpreted. Next thing is, the text is the result of the articulation of language. It is not innocent. Subtext and intertextuality reveal hidden agendas and ideological, social, political, cultural hierarchies. So we should not go to think that the text is this and this because it was designed as this and this. Clear? A writer conceives a text, but it is not necessary that that text should be complete a replica of his mind. It is articulated in a language, and language is deceptive. Language is not so innocent. It is dynamic. It changes person to person and author to author. So what the author meant, what meaning author had in his mind may not be the meaning which we construe. So we have to think that a text has subtext also, intertextuality also. So subtext and intertextuality has to be explored, and we have to see what are the ideological, social, and political and cultural hierarchies which have gone within the text, which have not been highlighted. Apparently, they cannot be seen. If we see the text critically, only then we can understand what ideologies are underpinned. This is very important. Another point is, a reader is involved in the creation of meaning, which has no universality. Clear? So we have to do away with the idea that a particular text has a particular meaning or has a universal meaning. There are no universal meanings. A reader is always involved in a meaning-making process, and he is making a meaning of himself or for herself in his given circumstances. Clear? So there is no universal meaning. Clear? Next point is, text is only a site where author and reader negotiate meaning. Clear? And often authors and readers commit mistakes. Author thinks that he has instilled this meaning or that meaning, but when the reader read it, they have their own meanings. So text is a site where an author and a reader both are negotiating meaning. Clear? Convergences are there, but a universal meaning is difficult to arrive. So with this, I think I have taken a long run. Thank you.